A Navy SEAL appeared at a lonely widow's gate as the Montana snowstorm swallowed the road behind him. One hand held the leash of an exhausted German Shepherd mother. In his arms, two freezing puppies barely moved. Eleanor Hart had lived alone for years and had no intention of opening her home to a stranger. But how long could she watch them remain outside? Why did the mother dog seem more afraid of being taken back than of the storm? And what would happen when Eleanor discovered that the man at her gate was hiding wounds of his own? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late afternoon settled over the foothills outside Red Lodge, Montana, beneath a sky the color of unpolished steel. Snow had been falling since noon, first in thin, wandering flakes, and then in heavy sheets that erased the fences, softened the mountains, and made every familiar object appear farther away than it was. Eleanor Hart stood at the front window of her ranch house, one hand gripping the aluminum frame of her walker, and the other holding an official envelope she had already read 3 times. At 79, Eleanor was a small, narrow-shouldered woman whose body had begun surrendering pieces of freedom without asking permission. Her white hair was twisted into a severe knot at the back of her head, her skin pale and finely lined, and her blue-gray eyes still possessed the sharpness that had once made hired hands confess mistakes before she had spoken a word. A fall on the frozen porch the previous winter had damaged her hip badly enough that the doctors insisted she use a walker. Eleanor called it the silver nuisance and treated every offer of assistance as if someone had accused her of theft. The letter came from Carbon County. An inspector would arrive within 10 days to examine the furnace, the leaking section of roof above the spare bedroom, and the unstable rail beside the back steps. If the house was judged unsafe, Eleanor might no longer be permitted to remain there without regular assistance. The inspection had been requested by her daughter, Rebecca. At 54, Rebecca Hart was a tall, practical woman with ash-brown hair cut to her shoulders, a straight posture, and the permanently tired eyes of a county health nurse who spent her days persuading stubborn people to accept help. Rebecca had inherited Eleanor's determination, but not her talent for hiding it beneath silence. Nearly 5 years had passed since Rebecca last crossed the ranch gate. Their final argument had begun over a loose stare and ended with Eleanor accusing her daughter of waiting for the property to become available. Rebecca had gone very still, placed her coffee cup in the sink, and said, "One day, Mother, you may discover that being impossible to help is not the same as being strong." Eleanor had not forgiven the sentence because some insults were dangerous precisely because they were true. She folded the county notice twice, then once more, pressing the creases with her thumbnail. Beneath the cushion of the rocking chair was a shallow tear in the fabric where she kept things she did not want to destroy, but could not bear to see. Eleanor pushed the letter inside and lowered the cushion over it. That was when movement appeared beyond the white blur of the road. At first she thought it was a fence post bending in the storm. Then the shape moved again. A man was walking toward the gate. He was tall enough to appear awkward beneath the low gray sky, though nothing in his movement was uncertain. He advanced with the controlled economy of someone trained not to waste energy, each step placed carefully on the buried road. He wore a snow-dusted Navy working uniform Type 3 beneath a dark winter coat left partly open at the chest. At 39, Luke Carter had a broad, athletic frame, short, dark brown hair silvered with snow, and a closely trimmed beard that sharpened rather than softened his square jaw. His face was windburned, his nose slightly crooked from an old break, and a pale scar ran from beneath his right ear toward the collar of his uniform. He was a Navy SEAL, though Eleanor did not yet know his name or rank. What she saw first was not the uniform. It was the strain around his eyes, the restrained, private exhaustion of a man who had spent years teaching his body to continue after his mind had asked it to stop. Luke held a makeshift leash in his left hand. At the end of it walked a German Shepherd mother, perhaps 5 years old, painfully thin beneath a black and tan coat clumped with ice. One ear stood upright, while the other bent slightly at the torn tip. Her ribs showed when she moved, and her amber eyes remained fixed on the 2 puppies in Luke's arms, rather than on the house ahead. She did not follow him out of trust. She followed because he carried what mattered to her. The 2 German Shepherd puppies were no more than 8 weeks old, both black and tan, their ears still too soft to stand fully. One was larger, with oversized paws and an alert head that kept rising despite the cold. The smaller puppy barely moved, its muzzle tucked beneath Luke's coat, and its breaths too shallow to stir the fabric. Luke stopped outside the wire gate. He did not open it. Eleanor watched that detail with reluctant attention. The latch had no lock. A strong man could have stepped over the fence without slowing down. Instead, Luke remained on the road, while snow gathered on his shoulders and the mother dog pressed close to his leg. Eleanor moved onto the porch, each push of the walker sending pain through her hip. "This is private land," she called. "I know, ma'am." His voice was low and roughened by cold. "My truck went into a drainage ditch about 2 miles east. I swerved around a fallen pine." "You should have stayed with the vehicle." "I would have, if I were alone." The smaller puppy shifted weakly beneath his coat. Eleanor noticed it and resented him for allowing her to notice. Luke explained that he had found the dogs near an abandoned outbuilding before the road disappeared beneath the storm. He did not ask for money. He did not ask to enter her house. He looked toward the weathered barn beyond the yard and offered a simple exchange. One night in the barn for the animals. In return, he would split the wood piled beneath the porch roof, draw water from the hand pump before it froze solid, and repair the section of fence leaning toward the creek. "You arrive with 3 animals and a wrecked truck," Eleanor said, "then offer to solve problems I did not invite you to inspect?" "I'm offering work, not pity." "I don't need either." Luke's gaze moved to her walker, then to the woodpile, where fewer than a dozen usable logs remained. He saw the frozen livestock trough and the sagging rail beside the steps. His eyes did not linger, but Eleanor felt examined more thoroughly than if he had walked through every room in the house. She hated him for his silence, before she hated him for what he said next. "You don't have anyone here to help you," Luke said, "and I don't have anywhere to keep these 3 alive tonight." The words landed with no drama, which made them worse. Eleanor's grip tightened around the walker. "You know nothing about who I have." "No, ma'am." "Then do not speak as though you do." Luke lowered his eyes, not in submission, but because the smaller puppy had begun trembling. The mother dog rose onto her toes, pulling the leash tight, her attention fixed on the bundle in his arms. For an instant, Eleanor saw 4 creatures outside her gate, though only 3 wore fur. The man was trying so hard to stand like someone in control that she could almost see the effort holding him upright. "The barn," Eleanor said at last. "The dogs may stay in the barn until morning." Luke looked toward the dark structure. "And me?" "You survived Navy training, I assume?" A faint, humorless curve touched one corner of his mouth. "That was in better weather." "That sounds like poor planning on the Navy's part." Eleanor pushed the gate open just wide enough for him to pass. The mother dog hesitated, then crossed after the puppies. Luke carried them into the barn and arranged old feed sacks over a bed of straw. He worked without complaining, using his coat to block the wind leaking through the boards. Eleanor returned to the house before he could thank her, irritated by the idea that he might. Darkness came early. The snow continued, thick and relentless, covering Luke's footprints between the gate and the barn. Eleanor heated water for tea but forgot to drink it. Several times she told herself she was checking whether the barn roof could bear the weight of the snow. Each time her eyes found Luke instead. He had only one wool blanket. He wrapped it around the 2 puppies and tucked the edges beneath the mother dog's body. Then he sat outside the barn door with his back against a wooden post, using himself to block the wind from reaching them. Snow gathered in his beard and along his shoulders. He did not knock on the house. He did not ask Eleanor to reconsider. He simply remained there, growing whiter beneath the storm. Eleanor stood behind the window until her hip began to ache from bearing her weight. Then she reached for the lamp and turned it off, so Luke would not know she had been watching. The room went dark, but she did not move away. For years, Eleanor had trained herself not to look toward the road, because roads carried people away far more often than they brought anyone home. That night, however, she remained beside the glass, unable to turn her back on the man outside the gate. By midnight, the wind had changed direction. It came down from the Beartooth Mountains in long, violent gusts, striking the western wall of the ranch house hard enough to rattle the window panes in their frames. Snow no longer fell gently over the fields. It traveled sideways, dry and sharp, scraping across the roof and filling every hollow in the yard. Eleanor Hart lay awake beneath two quilts, staring into the darkness while the old house groaned around her. The bedroom smelled faintly of cedar, dust, and the lavender soap she still bought out of habit, even though there was no one close enough to notice. Her walker stood beside the bed, its metal frame catching a pale strip of moonless light from the hall. Eleanor had learned that night sounds grew larger when a person lived alone. A loose shutter became a hand at the wall, a branch became a footstep. The settling stove became someone drawing breath in the next room. Most nights she could name every noise and dismiss it. That night, beneath the wind, she heard something she could not dismiss. A thin, uneven cry coming from the barn. Eleanor turned onto her side and pulled the quilt higher. The animals had shelter. The soldier had chosen to remain outside. Those were facts, and facts were cleaner than feelings. She told herself the barn walls were thick enough, that German shepherds were working dogs, that Luke Carter had probably slept in worse conditions while serving in places she would never know. She also reminded herself that people had passed her gate for years without stopping. After Henry died, neighbors brought casseroles for 12 days. On the 13th, the kitchen table was empty again. When Eleanor fell the previous winter, the ambulance crew had been kind, but kindness delivered by men checking a schedule did not remain after the vehicle left. Rebecca had stayed for 3 nights, rearranged the pantry, labeled Eleanor's pills, and spoken too carefully. By the 4th morning, Eleanor had accused her daughter of treating her like a patient. Rebecca had packed without arguing. Eleanor had watched her drive away and called the silence afterward relief. Human beings were skilled at renaming what hurt them. The puppy cried again, weaker than before. Eleanor closed her eyes. "Not my responsibility," she said aloud, but the room gave the words back without conviction. Several minutes passed. The wind struck the house. Somewhere outside, wood banged against wood. Then the crying stopped. Silence should have comforted her. Instead, fear entered the room so quietly that Eleanor did not recognize it until her heart began beating faster. She sat up, pushed the quilts away, and reached for the walker. Her hip protested before her feet touched the floor. Pain had become an argumentative companion, always present, always ready to remind her that the body kept its own records. He pulled on her wool robe, shoved her feet into lined slippers, and stood. The clock on the bedside table read 2:12. By the time she crossed the hall, paused twice to breathe, and reached the front door, it read 2:17. Opening the door was like opening the house directly into winter. Snow swept over the threshold and curled around her slippers. "Carter!" Eleanor shouted. The wind took his name and tore it apart. She shouted again, louder. A shape rose beside the barn. Luke appeared through the blowing snow with the larger puppy pressed against his chest and the smaller one tucked beneath his coat. The mother dog followed on the makeshift leash, head low, body tense. Luke's beard was crusted with ice, and his face had lost some of its color, but he walked steadily toward the porch. "Bring them inside," Eleanor ordered. Luke stopped at the bottom step. "You said the barn." "I have changed my mind. Try not to make a national event out of it." He looked at her for half a second, perhaps deciding whether gratitude would offend her. "Yes, ma'am." And if any of them die on my property, I will have to answer questions. I dislike questions. Luke climbed the steps and crossed the porch, but the mother dog stopped at the threshold, her paws spread against the boards. Her amber eyes moved from the dark doorway to Luke's hands, then back to the puppies. Luke gave the leash a careful pull. The dog recoiled so violently that her ribs struck the porch rail. She bared her teeth not with boldness but with panic, a low growl trembling through her narrow chest. "Easy," Luke said. His voice changed, firmer, more controlled. "Come on, inside." He pulled again, only slightly. The German shepherd twisted backward, claws scraping the wood. The larger puppy whimpered, and the mother lunged toward Luke before catching herself at the end of the leash. Luke shifted his weight automatically, positioning his body between the dog and the puppies. Eleanor saw the movement for what it was: trained, efficient, protective. And wrong for that moment. "Stop pulling her. She'll freeze out here. She knows that. Then she needs to move." Eleanor looked at the dog's torn ear, the hollow beneath her hips, and the wild calculation in her eyes. She has spent enough time being moved by people who thought they knew what she needed. Luke's jaw tightened. "Do you have a better idea?" Eleanor lowered herself with difficulty onto the floor just inside the doorway. Cold from the stone tiles traveled immediately through her robe. She placed both hands in her lap and turned her face slightly away from the dog. She did not call to her. She did not click her tongue or offer food. People often mistook eagerness for kindness. They reached too quickly, touched without permission, and expected trust as payment for good intentions. Eleanor had done the same to Rebecca for years, forcing advice upon her and calling resistance ingratitude. Perhaps that was why she recognized the look in the dog's eyes. Luke stood motionless, the puppies held close beneath his coat. "What are you doing?" "Nothing." "It's cold." "I am aware. I am sitting on it." Minutes passed. Snow blew through the open doorway and melted along the stone. The mother dog's growl faded. Her nose worked the air. She watched Eleanor, but Eleanor did not challenge her with direct eye contact. At last, the dog extended one paw across the threshold, then another. Her body remained low as she entered, dragging the leash behind her. She moved straight to Luke, pressed her nose against both puppies, and followed him into the kitchen. Eleanor tried to rise and discovered that sitting on a freezing floor at 79 was easier than standing from one. Luke placed the puppies in a laundry basket lined with towels, then returned and offered his hand. Eleanor stared at it. "I can manage. I'm sure you can." The fact that he did not withdraw his hand irritated her more than an argument would have. After a moment, she took it. Luke lifted only when she pushed with her good leg, allowing her to decide how much help she accepted. That small restraint unsettled Eleanor. Most people either ignored weakness or rushed to take command of it. In the kitchen, Luke settled the puppies beside the stove while the mother dog curled around them, still watching him with suspicion. When he opened Eleanor's pantry, his expression changed. There were 6 cans of soup, a jar of tea, half a sleeve of crackers, powdered milk, 2 onions gone soft at the neck, and potatoes beginning to sprout. "This is all you have?" "It has been sufficient." "For what? Surviving an afternoon?" "For avoiding company." Luke searched the cupboards, found a small piece of salt pork in the icebox, and announced that he would make stew. Eleanor almost objected, but warmth had begun returning painfully to her feet, and she lacked the energy for another battle. Luke moved around the kitchen with confidence entirely unsupported by talent. He cut the potatoes too large, burned the onions, and added enough salt to preserve a buffalo. The finished stew was gray, unevenly cooked, and smelled like wet leather beside a campfire. Eleanor took one spoonful and looked at him. "Did the Navy teach you this?" "No, ma'am." "Good. The country may still be safe." Luke laughed once, a brief sound that seemed to surprise him. Eleanor ate the entire bowl. Hunger, unlike pride, had no interest in maintaining appearances. The mother dog allowed the stronger puppy to nurse, but the smaller one lay apart, its sides moving too quickly. Luke noticed before Eleanor did. He put down his spoon and crossed the kitchen. The puppy's breathing had become shallow and irregular, each breath requiring visible effort. Luke lifted the tiny body into his palms. The puppy gave one faint gasp, then went still. Something inside Luke broke its formation. His face changed, all restraint stripped away at once. He rubbed the puppy's chest with 2 fingers and bent close, listening for breath. "Come on," he whispered. "Come on, Lucy." The name entered the kitchen before either of them could pretend it had not been spoken. Eleanor stood beside the table, one hand resting on her walker. Luke had insisted that the puppies were only animals he was transporting to safety. He had spoken of shelter, distance, weather, and practical choices. Yet a person did not accidentally name what he considered temporary. Responsibility was the word people used when love frightened them because it sounded disciplined and did not admit how much could be lost. Luke held Lucy against his chest, his hands trembling despite all the cold he had endured outside. Eleanor said nothing. For once, silence was not refusal. It was the only respectful place she could give him to be afraid. Lucy's body remained still for only a few seconds, though to Luke Carter those seconds stretched wide enough to contain every failure he had spent years refusing to name. He rubbed the tiny German Shepherd puppy's chest with 2 fingers, bent close to her muzzle, and whispered the name again. "Lucy." A faint tremor passed through her ribs. Then came a thin breath, followed by another, uneven but present. Luke closed his eyes briefly, his forehead nearly touching the puppy's fur. Eleanor Hart watched from beside the table and pretended not to notice the relief that loosened his shoulders. Human beings often protected their dignity by looking away at the precise moment another person became vulnerable. Sometimes that was cruelty. Sometimes it was mercy. Eleanor decided, without admitting it, that Luke had earned the second kind. By morning, the storm had buried the lower fence and turned the road into a white, featureless strip. Luke managed to raise the county emergency channel on an old battery radio. A clipped voice reported fallen trees, blocked mountain passes, and no snowplow service to the eastern ranches for at least 3 days. Luke listened once, wrote down the important details on the back of an unpaid feed bill, and immediately began organizing the kitchen as though winter itself had become a mission under his command. He placed the laundry basket near the stove, folded towels beneath the puppies, divided the remaining salt pork into measured portions, and drew a schedule on a sheet of brown wrapping paper. Puppy temperature every hour, feeding every 2 hours, stove checked every 45 minutes, water rationed until the hand pump could be inspected. Eleanor read the schedule while drinking tea. "You have assigned my stove a busier life than most congressmen. It needs monitoring. It has heated this house since before you learned to tie your boots. And judging by the smoke stains, it has tried to kill everyone in it." Luke's humor was so dry it took Eleanor a moment to recognize it. She disliked that. It made arguing with him less satisfying. The stronger male puppy had recovered enough to crawl over his sister and chew the corner of a towel. He had thick black and tan fur, broad paws too large for his body, and the determined expression of a creature convinced that the world had been built entirely for him to bite. Lucy remained quieter, tucked close to the mother's abdomen, her small sides still rising too quickly. The German Shepherd mother lay curved around both puppies, one torn ear angled toward Luke at all times. She accepted food only after he stepped several feet away. Every movement in the kitchen passed through her body as tension before becoming action. Luke followed his schedule precisely. Eleanor disrupted it with equal discipline. When he instructed her not to move the basket, she moved it 3 inches farther from the stove because she believed the heat was too direct. When he measured powdered milk for Lucy, Eleanor added warm water because the mixture looked too thick. When he divided the firewood, she used 2 pieces from the pile marked Night Reserve before noon. "You're doing this deliberately," Luke said. "I dislike systems designed by guests." "I'm not a guest." "That is true. Guests are invited." Luke pressed his lips together. Eleanor could see him deciding whether respect for her age required silence. She hoped it did not. Age had already taken enough from her without taking honest disagreement, too. "The puppies need consistency," he said. "Living things need attention. Consistency is what people substitute when they are too frightened to improvise." That sounds poetic, but it doesn't make it useful. And that sounds military, which has the same problem. Their conflict was not truly about milk or firewood. Eleanor understood that even while participating in it. Luke made lists because lists suggested the world could be divided into manageable parts. Eleanor resisted because accepting his order would mean admitting that her own methods had stopped being enough. Pride is rarely a single grand feeling. More often it hides in small acts, moving a basket, refusing an offered hand, using the wrong pile of wood simply because another person labeled it correctly. Near midday, Luke noticed the mother dog favoring her rear left paw. A patch of fur above the pad was matted with dried mud and something darker. He brought over a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. "She needs that cleaned," he said. "She needs to decide you are not going to hurt her." "She can decide afterward." Luke approached slowly, keeping his body turned partly sideways. The dog's lips tightened. Her eyes followed his hand. He offered the cloth for her to smell, then reached toward the injured leg. She pulled the paw beneath her body. "Easy," he murmured. "I'm helping." Eleanor heard the mistake before Luke did. People often believed the word helping transformed every action that followed into kindness. Luke reached again. The mother dog snapped and caught the sleeve of his uniform. The fabric tore beneath her teeth. Luke reacted before thought could intervene. One hand controlled the dog's neck while the other pressed her shoulder down against the kitchen floor. His weight shifted with trained efficiency. The mother thrashed once, then froze, not calm, but defeated. A low sound escaped her chest as the puppies began to cry. The wooden ruler struck Luke's forearm with a sharp crack. He turned. Eleanor stood over him with one hand gripping her walker, and the old 30-inch school ruler raised in the other. "Release her." "She bit me." "She bit your sleeve." "She has an injured paw. I need to examine it. You need to let go." Luke's expression hardened. If that wound is infected, her feelings won't save her. Neither will terror. "She is an animal, Mrs. Hart, and you are a man large enough to crush her while explaining why it is necessary." For a second, neither moved. Then Luke released the dog and backed away. The mother scrambled toward the laundry basket, placing herself over the puppies. Her body shook so violently that the metal tags on the makeshift leash tapped against the floor. Luke rose slowly. Anger had brought color into his wind-burned face. "You are placing an animal's fear above her health. No." "I am telling you that fear is part of her health." "She cannot understand what I'm trying to do." "Then being stronger does not make you clearer." He stared at her. "Some things have to be done, whether the patient agrees or not." Eleanor leaned on the walker, breath shortened by the effort of standing. "You didn't pin her because she was dangerous. You pinned her because she reminded you there are things you cannot command into being well." Luke's jaw shifted. For the first time, his anger lost its direction. Eleanor knew she had struck somewhere real, and part of her regretted it. Another part, the harder, less admirable part, was relieved that she was not the only person in the room with exposed weakness. Luke carried the water bowl outside without answering. He spent the afternoon repairing the hand pump beside the kitchen yard. The iron handle had frozen at the joint, and the leather seal had dried enough to lose pressure. He worked with tools found in Henry's old shed, clearing ice, tightening bolts, and heating the metal carefully with water from the stove. Eleanor watched from the porch doorway. She told herself she was supervising her property. In truth, she was watching Luke because silence after an argument had always made her uneasy. Silence gave other people time to decide they no longer wished to remain. Luke found the broken rail first. One of the lower boards had split inward, and beneath it the snow preserved a shallow depression shaped like a body. Near the post was a brown stain that had survived beneath the overhang. Behind the wood box, he discovered Eleanor's heavy winter coat with one sleeve torn from shoulder to elbow. He returned to the kitchen carrying it. When? Eleanor did not pretend not to understand. 3 weeks ago. How long were you outside? It is irrelevant. How long? She looked toward the stove. Nearly 3 hours. Luke's face became very still. You lay in the snow for 3 hours? I eventually reached the porch. That is not an answer anyone should be proud of. I didn't say it with pride. Did you call Rebecca? The question cut more deeply than his anger. Eleanor gripped the edge of the table. No. Why? Because I had already survived it. That does not explain why you didn't call her. Eleanor looked at him at last. Because lying in the snow was easier than hearing my daughter say, I warned you. Luke's anger faded, leaving something more uncomfortable. Understanding did not always arrive gently. Sometimes it entered like cold air through a cracked wall and showed a person how much pain pride had been costing them. That night, the house became quiet except for the wind and the puppies shifting near the stove. Luke slept on the kitchen floor, several feet from the mother dog, giving her the distance he had not offered earlier. Eleanor went to her bedroom without saying goodnight. Sometime after midnight, Luke woke to a heavy sound from the hallway. Then came the scrape of metal and a sharp intake of breath. He reached Eleanor's bedroom door but did not open it. Mrs. Hart? No answer. He placed his hand against the wood. Eleanor, are you hurt? Inside, she sat on the floor beside the fallen walker, one leg bent awkwardly beneath her robe. Nothing appeared broken. That almost made it worse. She could see the bed less than 3 feet away, yet it might as well have stood across the frozen pasture. Luke waited outside. He did not enter. He did not announce that he knew what was best. Do you need help? He asked. Eleanor closed her eyes. The word felt larger than the room. It carried Rebecca's absence, 3 hours in the snow, the county letter beneath the chair cushion, and every door Eleanor had shut before another person could leave through it. The silence lasted so long that Luke reached for the handle. Yes, Eleanor whispered. Luke entered and found her beside the bed. He did not lift her. Instead, he sat on the floor a short distance away, his back against the wall, and his hands resting openly on his knees. Tell me how, he said. For the first time in years, Eleanor was not treated as a problem to be solved or a burden to be moved. She was simply a person allowed to decide how she would be helped. Morning never truly arrived. The darkness merely thinned behind the snow, turning the windows from black to a dull gray, while the storm continued to scrape across the ranch. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with a blanket around her shoulders, and the memory of the previous night still lodged uncomfortably inside her. Luke had helped her from the bedroom floor exactly as she instructed, one hand beneath her elbow, the other steadying the walker, no lifting until she was ready. He had not praised her for asking. He had not made the moment larger than it already was. That restraint should have made the humiliation easier. Instead, it made Eleanor understand how long she had confused dignity with never being witnessed in need. Near the stove, the mother German shepherd lay around her puppies, though her body no longer formed the same tight protective circle. Exhaustion had loosened her. The stronger male puppy slept with one large paw resting across his sister's back. Lucy did not protest. He lay on her side, her small muzzle slightly open, every breath accompanied by a faint, clicking sound. Luke had been awake most of the night. He knelt beside the laundry basket with his sleeves rolled to his forearms, checking Lucy's gums, listening to her chest, and recording the intervals between her breaths on the same brown paper he had used for his schedule. The tear in his sleeve from the mother dog remained unrepaired. He had not attempted to examine her injured paw again. Instead, he left a warm cloth near her and waited. Eleanor noticed that the cloth had gradually moved closer to the dog, though she could not tell whether Luke or the animal had moved it. "She's worse," Luke said. Eleanor heard the conclusion he had been delaying. How much worse? She's working too hard to breathe. She needs antibiotics, possibly oxygen. You carry oxygen in those pockets? No. Then stop looking at them as though one might appear. Luke lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, and the disciplined stillness he wore like another uniform had begun to crack at the edges. The radio battery is almost dead. The landline has no signal. I climbed halfway to the ridge before the wind turned me back. There's no safe way to reach the road. There is always a way. People simply dislike the cost of some of them. If we wait until morning, she may not have one. Eleanor looked down at Lucy. The puppy's small ribs rose and fell beneath the black and tan fur, each breath asking more from a body that had almost nothing left to give. Human beings like to imagine that survival belonged to the brave. It did not. Survival often belonged to whoever happened to be found before time ran out. There's the signal, Eleanor said. Luke waited. She regretted the words before they had fully left her mouth. The red lantern. He followed her gaze toward the porch. Hanging from a hook beside the front door was an old iron storm lantern with dark red glass. Snow had collected along its metal cap, and one side of the frame was rusted where the paint had worn away. Luke had noticed it when he first arrived, but assumed it was decorative. In this valley, Eleanor continued, a white porch lamp means someone is home. A yellow lantern means the road is passable. Red means someone inside needs immediate help. The Boone Ranch can see this porch from the western ridge when the snow isn't too thick. Other houses watch for it as well. Then we light it. No. Luke stared at her, certain he had misunderstood. You just said it's an emergency signal. I said what it means. I did not say we would use it. Why? Because it has not been lit in 12 years, Lucy coughed, a tiny, wet sound. Luke stood. That isn't an answer. It is the only one you are getting. He paced once toward the stove and back, anger supplying energy where sleep had failed. You would rather let that puppy stop breathing than admit to the valley that you need assistance? Eleanor's face tightened. Do not reduce my life to one ugly sentence because it makes your argument convenient. Then give me a better one. The lantern had belonged to Henry Hart, Eleanor's husband of 46 years. Henry had been a broad-chested rancher with heavy brown eyebrows, weathered hands, and a beard that grew silver long before the hair on his head. He was patient with livestock, careless with money, and incapable of passing a stranded traveler without offering fuel, food, or a bed. That generosity had infuriated Eleanor when she was young because she believed every kindness needed to fit inside a ledger. Henry disagreed. He said a storm did not ask whether a man had earned shelter before covering him in snow. For decades, Henry had lit the red lantern whenever someone was injured, lost, or trapped. He carried it to the gate during blizzards so frightened people could see the house from the road. On the night he died, he had driven to Red Lodge for medicine after Eleanor developed a fever. His truck slid from an icy bridge less than 4 miles from home. Eleanor had placed the lantern on the porch before he left, promising to keep it burning until he returned. It glowed until morning, its red light staining the snow while she waited beside the window. The sheriff came at dawn. Henry did not. After the funeral, Eleanor emptied the fuel, cleaned the glass, and hung the lantern back on its hook. She told everyone the valley had electric lights now and no longer needed old signals. The truth was less respectable. Eleanor could not bear to light something that had once promised a person could find the way home. Luke listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, his anger softened but did not disappear.
Henry used it to call for help.
He used it to help other people. Today there's no difference. There is every difference. Not to Lucy. Eleanor pushed back from the table. Do not use that puppy as a weapon against me. I'm trying to keep her alive. No, you are trying to win. Luke went still. Eleanor saw the change and knew she had reached the hidden center of him. You organize everything: food, firewood, breathing, You speak as if the right plan can force the world to return what it has taken. Lucy is not simply a dog to you. She is proof that you can still bring everyone back." His face hardened. "You don't know anything about that." "Then tell me I am wrong." The wind filled the silence between them. Luke sat opposite her, elbows resting on his knees. For several seconds he looked at the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its command. His name was Caleb Morgan. Caleb had been 34, lean and long-limbed, with sandy hair that never stayed within regulation, and a narrow face made warmer by an uneven grin. He had been the kind of man who remembered the birthdays of other people's children, and carried cinnamon gum because it reminded him of his mother's kitchen. During an evacuation overseas, Luke had been ordered to withdraw with the men he could still move before the route closed. Caleb was separated from the team after part of a structure collapsed. Luke had requested additional minutes. Command denied them. He followed the order and brought the surviving men out. Caleb did not return. "The decision was correct," Luke said. "Every review said so. The timing, the threat level, the number of lives at risk. I did exactly what I was trained to do." "But?" Luke looked toward Lucy. "A right decision can leave the person who made it living wrong afterward." Eleanor understood more than she wanted to. People believed guilt came only from doing evil. Sometimes guilt grew from choosing the least terrible option and discovering that the heart did not care about arithmetic. At the western end of the valley, Rebecca Hart stood beside a county medical truck stalled near the Boone property. At 54, Rebecca was tall like her father, with straight shoulders, ash-brown hair streaked with gray, and a face that looked composed even when she was frightened. Years as a community health nurse had made her patient with confused patients, angry families, and elderly men who hid medication beneath their tongues. Her patience with Eleanor was thinner because old injuries knew where to press. Rebecca was helping check isolated residents after the storm, carrying blankets, insulin, and emergency food from house to house. Every time she crossed the ridge, she looked east toward her mother's land. The ranch was invisible behind the snow. Rebecca knew Eleanor might be alone. He also remembered the last time she had arrived without permission. Eleanor had stood at the gate and told her that concern was not a key. Rebecca had promised never to cross again unless invited. It had sounded like anger then. 5 years later, it felt like a sentence they were both still serving. Back in the kitchen, Lucy's breathing faltered again. Luke stood. "I'm lighting it. You will not touch that lantern. If the choice is between offending you and losing her, it is my house, and she is dying in it." Eleanor struck the table with her palm. Pain ran up her wrist. "Do not mistake your fear for authority." Luke moved toward the door, then stopped. His hand remained at his side. He could have reached the lantern in 5 steps. Eleanor could not have stopped him. The fact that he did not move was not obedience. It was respect offered under pressure, the kind that cost something. Eleanor looked at Lucy, then at the mother dog whose amber eyes remained fixed on the puppy, then at the red lantern outside, dark beneath 12 winters. "Bring me the oil," she said. Luke retrieved a small metal can from the pantry shelf Eleanor indicated. She carried it herself to the porch, hanging one hand from the walker while gripping the can with the other. The wind pushed against her body as though winter had placed a palm against her chest. Luke filled the lantern, but he did not light it. Eleanor struck a match. The flame died instantly. She tried again. Her fingers trembled partly from cold and partly from memory. The second match broke. Luke stepped close. Eleanor expected him to take the box. He did not. Instead, he raised both hands around hers, forming a shelter against the wind without touching the match. Eleanor struck a third one. The flame bent, nearly vanished, then steadied within the circle of Luke's palms. She lifted it to the wick. The red glass filled with light. Across the valley, Rebecca was climbing back into the medical truck when a faint crimson point appeared through the white distance. She froze with one hand on the door. The red lantern at her mother's ranch was burning. Rebecca turned to the driver and pointed east. The truck's headlights shifted. Its engine rose above the wind, and a few minutes later, a pale beam began moving through the storm toward Eleanor's gate. The headlights reached the ranch before the vehicle itself could be seen. Two pale beams moved slowly through the blowing snow, vanishing behind drifts and returning closer each time, until a county medical truck emerged from the storm and stopped beside Eleanor Hart's gate. The red lantern still burned above the porch, its glass casting a crimson stain across the white yard. Eleanor stood inside the kitchen with both hands around her walker. She had imagined Rebecca arriving many times during the 5 years they had barely spoken. In some versions, Eleanor remained cold and dignified. In others, Rebecca apologized before crossing the threshold. Not once had Eleanor imagined herself standing in a worn robe beside a dying puppy, with a stranger's terrible stew still drying in a pot, and her own need glowing publicly above the door. Rebecca Hart climbed down from the passenger side. At 54, she was tall like her late father, with long arms, a straight back, and ash-brown hair streaked with gray and tied loosely at the nape of her neck. Snow clung to the shoulders of her navy county coat. Her face was narrow and capable, with tired hazel eyes that had learned to remain calm while frightened people shouted at her. Years as a community health nurse had made Rebecca gentle with strangers and less patient with her mother, because strangers did not know the exact words required to reopen old wounds. She looked at the red lantern first, then at Eleanor through the window. Neither woman waved. Dr. Helen Morris stepped from the driver's side carrying a black medical case. Helen was 63, broad-hipped and compact, with cropped silver hair, weather-reddened cheeks, and small dark eyes behind square spectacles. She had treated animals across Carbon County for 36 years and possessed the blunt efficiency of a woman who had delivered calves in freezing barns, stitched ranch dogs on kitchen tables, and learned that panic rarely improved when spoken to politely. Her green canvas coat was patched at one elbow, and her heavy boots were whitened with salt. She had lost her husband to cancer 7 years earlier and had responded by working longer hours, not because she was avoiding grief, she insisted, but because sick animals were less complicated than grieving people. The third person was Walter Boone, 74, the nearest neighbor to Eleanor's western boundary. Walter was a lean, weather-bent man with a long white mustache, a brown felt hat pulled low over his ears, and hands permanently stained by engine grease. He had spent 40 years repairing farm equipment and now pretended retirement meant only working without invoices. Walter was sociable with everyone except Eleanor, who had once told him his repaired gate leaned more than he did. Since then, their friendship had consisted mainly of mutual insults delivered across fence lines. Luke opened the door before they reached the porch. "Puppies in respiratory distress." Helen entered without removing her coat. "Then stop explaining and show me." Lucy lay in the laundry basket beside the stove, her small body wrapped in towels. The mother German shepherd rose immediately, placing herself between Helen and the puppies. A low growl moved through her chest. Helen stopped several feet away. She did not crouch or extend her hand. "She yours?" "No," Luke said. "I found them." "That wasn't what I asked." Luke glanced at the dog. "No, she isn't mine." "Good. Then nobody here gets to pretend they know what she owes them." Helen instructed Luke to carry Lucy to the kitchen table, while Eleanor blocked the mother dog's view with a folded blanket, held at waist height. The dog paced behind the barrier, trembling but not lunging. Helen listened to Lucy's chest, checked her gums, examined her eyes, and placed a small thermometer beneath her foreleg. Her movements were quick but never abrupt. "Pneumonia," Helen said. "Likely started with exposure and weakness. She's badly underweight, too." "Can you save her?" Luke asked. Helen looked up sharply. "I can treat her. I don't promise what living bodies will do afterward." The answer irritated him because it denied him certainty, yet Eleanor saw respect appear beneath his frustration. Helen prepared an antibiotic injection, warmed fluids, and placed a small portable oxygen mask near Lucy's muzzle. The puppy resisted weakly, which Helen called encouraging. Luke remained beside the table, one hand resting near Lucy without touching her. He watched every breath as if his attention could keep each one from becoming the last. Rebecca had not yet spoken to Eleanor. He removed her gloves, placed the emergency food boxes on the counter, and examined the room with the practiced eye of a nurse. She noticed the scarce pantry, the cracked stove tile, the damp stain above the doorway, and the blanket around Eleanor's shoulders. Most of all, she noticed the walker positioned too far from the chair, the sort of small, careless detail that could send an older person to the floor. "You should sit," Rebecca said. "I have been sitting for most of my life lately. Your color is poor. My color has always been poor. Your father said I looked suspiciously pale at our wedding." Rebecca did not smile. "Why didn't you call before the storm? The telephone was down. It wasn't down last week." Eleanor knew where the conversation was going and attacked first. "You contacted the county." Rebecca's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Yeah. You requested an inspection of my home without telling me. I requested that someone confirm the furnace was safe and the roof wasn't coming down on you. You had no right. I am your daughter. That is not ownership." "No," Rebecca said. "Apparently it isn't even permission to worry." Walter became deeply interested in the stovepipe. Helen continued working as if family arguments were another kind of weather. Luke kept his eyes on Lucy, though Eleanor knew he was listening. "You haven't crossed my gate in 5 years, Eleanor said. Rebecca's face tightened. "You told me not to. A daughter should know when her mother doesn't mean something. A mother should not make love depend on mind reading." The words landed harder than either woman intended. Eleanor felt the old urge to become cruel before Rebecca could continue. Cruelty had always been easier than confession because it left the speaker standing. Rebecca stepped closer, her voice lowered. "You tell people no one comes. You tell Walter you have no help. You tell the county you manage everything alone. But every time I bring food, you refuse it. Every time I offer to stay, you accuse me of wanting the land. Every time I call, you make me feel ashamed for asking whether you are alive." "I never asked you to feel ashamed. You never had to." Rebecca's eyes shone, but she did not cry. "Mother, you were not abandoned. You drove people away and then used the silence as proof that no one cared." The kitchen became quiet except for Lucy's oxygen and the wind against the windows. Eleanor looked down at her hands. Those hands had managed ledgers, repaired harnesses, delivered a calf when Henry was trapped in town, and once carried Rebecca through 3 miles of floodwater when she was 7. Now they had trembled around a match until Luke shielded them from the wind. Eleanor did not apologize. She did not know how to cross so great a distance in one sentence. She only said, "The lantern was lit." Rebecca swallowed. "I saw it." Helen finished securing the fluid line and turned her attention to the mother dog. The German shepherd remained beside the basket, her black and tan coat still rough with dried mud. Up close, Helen saw more than thinness. The skin along the dog's underside had been stretched repeatedly. Her nails were worn unevenly from standing on hard flooring. A faint circular mark remained around one rear ankle, and several old scars hid beneath the fur near her shoulders. "How many litters?" Luke asked. "More than her body should have carried," Helen replied. 5, perhaps 6, maybe more." Helen slowly lifted a metal instrument from her case. The soft click of its hinge made the dog recoil so violently that she struck the cupboard. Her lips drew back and she lowered herself over the puppies. Helen immediately placed the instrument on the floor and stepped away. "She knows that sound." "From what?" Eleanor asked. "Cage latches, restraint tools, could be several things." Helen's mouth hardened. Whatever it was, she learned metal meant someone was about to make a decision for her. Luke looked toward the window. The place where I found them had indoor runs, steel doors. Most of the roof had collapsed. Helen faced him. Where? Mercer Creek Kennels, about 2 miles east of the county road. Walter stopped pretending not to listen. Calvin Mercer owns that property. Calvin Mercer was 61, a wealthy cattleman and dog breeder whose name appeared on local charity boards, livestock auctions, and campaign donations. He was a large man with carefully combed, iron-gray hair, a trimmed mustache, and the polished manners of someone who had learned that a calm voice could carry power farther than shouting. He had inherited land from his father and influence from no one, building it through favors remembered and debts collected. To many in Red Lodge, Calvin was generous. To those dependent on him, he was orderly. Order, Eleanor knew, could become cruelty while keeping its hands clean. Luke explained that he had seen no workers, no functioning heat, and no other living animals. A section of the structure had collapsed beneath the snow. The mother dog had been trapped behind wire with the puppies. He had cut the latch and taken them before his truck went into the ditch. "Did you photograph it?" Rebecca asked. "My phone died in the cold after 2 pictures. Neither shows much." "Any official report?" "No signal," Helen sighed. "Then you have an injured dog, 2 puppies, and your word." Before Luke could answer, an engine sounded beyond the yard. This one was heavier than the medical truck and approached without hesitation. The mother dog heard it first. Her head snapped toward the window, her body stiffened. A black pickup stopped outside the gate. Calvin Mercer stepped out wearing a charcoal wool coat over pressed jeans and expensive winter boots. Beside him emerged Sheriff Owen Briggs, 58, thick-necked and square-faced, with close-cropped gray hair and a careful expression shaped by 25 years of trying not to turn neighbors into enemies. Owen was not dishonest, but he valued peace so highly that he sometimes mistook it for justice. The mother dog saw Calvin through the window. She rose over her puppies, legs trembling so violently that her paws shifted on the floor. A growl escaped her, deeper than any sound she had made toward Luke. She was terrified, yet she did not retreat. Her body became a wall between Calvin and her young. Eleanor watched the dog. Then she looked at Calvin waiting outside with papers in one gloved hand. She turned her walker toward the porch. "Mother," Rebecca said, "let Owen come inside." "No." Eleanor crossed the yard slowly, Luke and the dog behind her. At the gate, she lifted the latch herself. Calvin offered a courteous smile. "Mrs. Hart, I believe that man has property belonging to me." Eleanor opened the gate, then positioned her walker directly in front of Luke and the 3 German shepherds. "You may bring your papers onto my land," she said, "but first you will explain why an animal that belongs to you is more afraid of you than she was of freezing to death." Calvin Mercer did not raise his voice. Men like Calvin rarely needed to. He stood just inside Eleanor Hart's gate with snow settling neatly across the shoulders of his charcoal coat, while Sheriff Owen Briggs remained half a step behind him. Calvin removed a leather folder from beneath his arm and opened it with the care of a banker presenting mortgage papers. Inside were registration certificates, breeding records, veterinary receipts, and photographs of the German shepherd mother before hunger had narrowed her body. In those pictures, her coat was cleaner and her ribs hidden, but the same torn ear angled away from the camera. "Her registered name is Mercer's Black Rose," Calvin said. "She is 6 years old. The male puppy is already promised to a buyer in Bozeman, and the female was to be evaluated after 8 weeks. Luke stood beside the porch steps, broad shoulders rigid beneath his torn uniform sleeve. "You mean sold?" "I mean placed, according to contract." Behind Luke, the mother dog remained inside the doorway, her body positioned across the entrance to the kitchen. The stronger puppy pressed beneath her chest. Lucy lay in a basket near Helen's portable oxygen equipment, too weak to notice that several adults were calmly discussing who had the right to decide where she would spend the rest of her life. Calvin handed the folder to Owen. "Everything is lawful." Owen examined the papers. His square face gave away little, but his mouth tightened when Helen joined them. The veterinarian still wore her green canvas coat, and her cropped silver hair stood unevenly where she had repeatedly pushed her spectacles back into place. "The puppy is not fit to travel," Helen said. "The mother is malnourished, lame, and carrying old restraint injuries." Calvin looked disappointed rather than offended. "I was away for several weeks."
A caretaker failed to maintain the property during the storm.
"Convenient caretaker," Walter muttered from the porch. Calvin ignored him. "Neglect by an employee does not erase ownership." "No," Eleanor said. "It merely gives a respectable man someone poorer to blame." Calvin turned toward her. "Mrs. Hart, I understand that this situation is upsetting, but sentiment does not change documents." Eleanor looked at the pages in Owen's hand. The papers were clean. That troubled her more than anger would have. Nothing in the folder showed steel doors, frozen water, or an animal shrinking from the click of a metal instrument. Paper had always possessed that talent. It could make a harsh thing appear orderly by leaving out whoever had suffered beneath it. 40 years earlier, Eleanor had used the same language. The dead ranch hand had been named Thomas Bell. He was 32, tall and narrow through the shoulders, with sun-browned skin, red-blonde hair, and a shy smile that appeared only when someone spoke about his children. Thomas worked quietly, never drank on weekdays, and always removed his hat before entering the Hart kitchen. One autumn morning, a damaged pulley broke while he was lifting feed sacks into the loft. He fell onto the packed earth below and died before Henry could bring the truck around. Thomas left a wife named Mary and 2 boys under 10. Mary Bell had been 29, a thin woman with pale, freckled skin, light brown hair she wore in a loose braid, and hands reddened by lye soap and cold water. She did not cry when Eleanor and Henry visited the workers' cottage after the funeral. She stood beside the table with one hand resting on the younger boy's shoulder and listened while Eleanor explained that the cottage belonged to the ranch, not to the family. 30 days, Eleanor had told her. Mary had asked for another month. The older boy had already found work stacking wood at a neighboring place, and she believed she could save enough to rent 2 rooms in town. Eleanor had refused. Winter was coming, another ranch hand would need the cottage, and the Hart property could not support every family touched by misfortune. She had said those exact words. Mary thanked her anyway. That memory returned now with an unpleasant clarity. The braid over Mary's shoulder, the younger boy holding a wooden horse, the careful way the widow folded the eviction notice before placing it in her apron pocket. Eleanor had considered the woman's politeness proof that the decision had been accepted. Age had taught her that silence often meant only that a person had no safe place to put anger. Eleanor never learned where Mary took the boys. Calvin's voice brought her back. "The dogs will remain here until the road opens, if Dr. Morris believes transport is unsafe. After that, I expect them returned." Luke took one step toward him. "They're not going back." Calvin's expression barely changed. "That will not be your decision." "Then whose? The man with the clean paperwork or the animal shaking when she sees his truck?" Owen closed the folder. "For tonight, the dogs stay under veterinary care. When the weather clears, there will be an investigation. Until then, nobody removes them." Calvin studied Luke as though measuring the inconvenience he represented. "You entered private property and cut a secured enclosure. The roof was coming down. You still took what was not yours." Luke's hands tightened at his sides. Eleanor saw how deeply the accusation reached. The dogs did not belong to him. That fact mattered legally. Yet he had carried them through snow, surrendered his coat, and sat outside a stranger's barn rather than leave them. Ownership and responsibility had crossed paths at her gate, and only one of them had arrived willing to freeze. Calvin replaced the papers in his folder. "I will return when the county road is open." The black truck disappeared into the storm, with Owen following behind. Walter left to inspect the medical vehicle's chains, and Helen returned to Lucy. Rebecca remained in the kitchen, silently washing the cup Helen had used to mix medication. Luke stood near the stove, packing the few things he had taken from his coat pockets: a folding knife, a wet wallet, 2 empty ration wrappers, and a small radio with a dead battery. Eleanor watched him. "What are you doing?" "When Lucy is stable enough, I'm leaving." "You have no truck. Walter says he can pull it from the ditch tomorrow." "And then?" "I file my statement, Helen files hers, the county handles Mercer." "You brought the dogs here, and now you're fighting with a powerful man because of it? Do not flatter yourself. I have been fighting powerful men since before you grew that beard." Luke pushed the knife into his pocket.
This is not your problem.
The sentence struck Eleanor with the force of an insult because it resembled something she had said for most of her life. "You stood outside my gate and informed me that I had no one. Now that someone may ask you to remain, you are suddenly concerned about boundaries." His eyes narrowed. "I'm trying not to turn your house into another battlefield." "No. You are leaving before anyone can decide they want you here." Rebecca stopped washing but did not turn around. Luke's voice became quieter. "You don't know what I do when people want me to stay. I know exactly what you do. You call departure responsibility and hope no one notices you are afraid." He stepped closer. "And what do you do, Eleanor? You make people leave, then tell yourself they chose it. At least when I walk away, I use my own feet." The truth of it entered the room like broken glass. Eleanor grabbed the cup beside her and threw it. It struck the wall, shattered above the baseboard, and scattered white pieces across the kitchen floor. The mother dog rose sharply over her puppies. Lucy stirred in the basket. Rebecca looked from her mother to Luke. She could have defended one of them. Instead, she set the dishcloth down. "I'm not choosing a winner," she said. "You are both too practiced at losing people." Luke took his coat and walked out through the back door. Eleanor heard the barn latch a few moments later. No one spoke while Rebecca swept the broken cup. That night, Helen slept in the spare room to monitor Lucy. Rebecca remained on the parlor sofa. Eleanor sat by the stove pretending to read an old newspaper while the mother dog rested beside the puppies. Near midnight, Eleanor looked down and discovered the animal was gone. The back door stood slightly open. They found her at the unused equipment shed behind the barn. Snow covered her back as she scratched frantically at one corner of the floor.
Luke knelt nearby, pulling loose a rotten plank while Rebecca held a lantern. Beneath the boards lay an old leather satchel, stiffened by age. Eleanor recognized it before anyone opened it. It had belonged to Henry. Inside were ranch ledgers, payroll slips, and envelopes tied with faded string. Eleanor turned the brittle pages until one entry stopped her hand. Thomas Bell. Final wages unpaid. Beneath it was a smaller sheet bearing Mary Bell's last known address in Laurel, Montana. The amount was modest by present standards. At the time, it might have paid several months' rent. Henry had written a note beside it. "Eleanor says the account is closed. I am not certain she is right." For a long time, Eleanor could not speak. The mother dog sat beside her, snow melting from her torn ear. "I told myself we owed them nothing after Thomas died," Eleanor finally said. "It appears we owed them more than money." Luke remained across the shed, neither comforting nor accusing her. Eleanor closed the ledger and held it against her chest. "Perhaps I cannot repair what happened 40 years ago," she said. "But I can stop repeating it." 5 days after the storm, the road to Red Lodge reopened beneath a sky so clear that the mountains appeared close enough to touch. The snowplows left high white walls along both sides of the county road, and sunlight flashed from the frozen fields with a brightness that made Eleanor Hart's eyes ache. Lucy was breathing without oxygen now, though she remained thin and slept more than the stronger male puppy. The German Shepherd mother still watched every doorway and flinched at metal sounds, but she had begun accepting food while Luke remained in the room. That small change should have felt like victory. Instead, the kitchen table held a registered letter from Calvin Mercer's attorney. Calvin had filed a formal complaint claiming Luke had stolen valuable animals from private property.
He also alleged that Eleanor had been pressured by Luke and Rebecca into withholding the dogs and converting part of her land into a refuge. The petition requested the immediate return of the animals, an investigation into Eleanor's ability to manage her affairs, and an order preventing any alteration of the ranch until her mental capacity had been reviewed. Calvin's language was calm, careful, and almost compassionate. According to the document, he was not trying to take anything from an elderly widow. He was protecting her from people who had arrived during a moment of weakness. Eleanor read the final paragraph twice. "He has made me sound like an antique table someone is trying to steal." Rebecca stood across the kitchen in a gray wool coat, her ash-brown hair pinned neatly behind her ears. She had stayed at the ranch since the storm, sleeping badly on the parlor sofa and correcting herself each time she nearly took charge without asking. "He is using your age because he cannot explain the condition of the dogs. And you requested an inspection because you believed I could no longer manage alone? I believe the house might kill you. That is not the same as believing you have no mind. To the person being examined, the difference can feel very small." Rebecca absorbed the sentence without defending herself. Their relationship had changed only slightly, but sometimes a slight change was the difference between a door locked and a door left on the latch. The hearing took place in the Carbon County Administration Building, a square brick structure with 12 stone steps that had seemed ordinary to Eleanor when she was younger. At 79, every step looked like an argument. Luke parked Walter's truck near the entrance and came around to help. He wore clean civilian clothes borrowed from Walter, dark jeans, a heavy brown coat, and boots half a size too large. Without his uniform, he looked less like a symbol and more like a tired man with a neatly trimmed beard, a healing tear across one sleeve, and eyes that had not learned how to rest. "I can carry you," he said. "You can also throw me through the window. Neither will be necessary." Eleanor gripped the rail and climbed. One step, then another. At the fourth, pain traveled from her hip into her lower back, and her right knee began to shake. Luke did not touch her. He stood close enough to catch her, but far enough to let the decision remain hers. At the sixth step, Eleanor stopped. The people waiting near the entrance pretended not to watch. Pride urged her upward. Her body refused. She released one hand from the rail and held it toward Luke. He offered his forearm rather than taking her wrist. Eleanor leaned on him, and together they climbed the remaining steps. Luke did not pull or praise her. He simply matched her pace. Human beings often imagined help as one person becoming strong for another. Eleanor was beginning to understand that good help was quieter. It allowed weakness to exist without turning it into ownership. The emergency hearing was chaired by Commissioner Grace Holloway, a 67-year-old former school superintendent with a rounded figure, short white curls, and steady brown eyes. Grace was known for listening longer than impatient people liked, and for asking one final question after everyone believed the matter was settled. Two other commissioners sat beside her, along with Sheriff Owen Briggs and the county animal control officer. Calvin occupied the front row in a navy suit, his iron gray hair perfectly combed and his mustache trimmed. His attorney described him as a respected breeder, landowner, and community benefactor. The dogs, the attorney said, had been legally registered, properly valued, and unlawfully removed. Eleanor was presented as a vulnerable widow whose recent fall and isolation made her susceptible to influence. Calvin spoke gently when called. "I bear Mrs. Hart no ill will. I simply believe that sudden decisions made during a crisis should be examined carefully." Grace looked toward Eleanor. "Mrs. Hart, would you like someone to speak for you?" "No," Eleanor said. "That is largely why we are here." Rebecca testified first. She provided Eleanor's recent cognitive assessment, medication records, and a written statement from her physician confirming that Eleanor understood her finances, property, health risks, and the consequences of creating a refuge. Rebecca's hands remained folded in her lap as she spoke. "I disagree with some of my mother's choices," she said. "I believe she needs more assistance than she accepts. I believe the ranch requires repairs she delayed too long.
but disagreement is not incapacity. If I used my medical training to take away her voice because she frustrates me, I would not be protecting her. I would be punishing her for being difficult. Eleanor looked at her daughter. Rebecca did not look back, perhaps because courage was sometimes easier when love was not watching directly. Helen Morris presented photographs of the mother dog's emaciated body, worn nails, scarred ankle, damaged paw, and signs of repeated breeding. She described Lucy's pneumonia and the condition of both puppies when Luke arrived. Helen did not claim to know every injury's cause. Her restraint made the facts harder to dismiss. Could poor care during one storm explain everything? Calvin's attorney asked. No, Helen replied. A storm did not produce years of reproductive strain or old restraint scars. Walter Boone entered with a woman named Nora Whitcomb. Nora was 48, short and squarely built, with prematurely gray hair cut unevenly at her jaw and rough red hands marked by cleaning chemicals. She had worked at Mercer Creek Kennels for 14 months. Her nervous habit was rubbing the side of her thumb until the skin turned white. Nora had remained silent because Calvin's business employed her younger brother, and because fear often disguised itself as practicality until another living creature paid the price. Nora testified that the dogs were kept in narrow indoor runs, that heat failed repeatedly, and that the German Shepherd mother had been bred despite losing weight after her previous litter. Nora had complained once. She was told she could leave if she disliked professional breeding. Why speak now? Grace asked. Nora looked at the photographs. Because I kept telling myself I wasn't the one hurting them. I was only cleaning afterward. That sentence has stopped letting me sleep. Luke's testimony was brief. He admitted cutting the enclosure and removing the dogs without permission. He admitted he had not entered the property intending to build a legal case. He had seen a collapsing roof, a starving mother, and 2 puppies in danger. I did not come to Mrs. Hart's ranch looking for a home, he said. I wanted one night of shelter. Then I planned to deliver the dogs somewhere safe and disappear. That is what I do when a task is over. I leave before anyone expects more from me. Calvin's attorney asked whether Luke considered himself a rescuer. No, Luke replied. I considered myself a man trying not to fail again. Finally, Eleanor moved to the witness table. She did not describe herself as a helpless widow. She did not describe Luke as a hero. She told the commissioners she had left him and 3 freezing dogs outside because she resented being seen in need. She admitted hiding a dangerous fall from Rebecca. Then she spoke of Thomas and Mary Bell, the family she had removed from a ranch cottage 40 years earlier. I obeyed the property rules, Eleanor said. I also did something wrong. Those truths can occupy the same room. Calvin shifted in his seat. I pushed my daughter away and then called myself abandoned. I left a soldier and 3 animals outside because I believed my suffering excused me from mercy. Now Mr. Mercer suggests that recognizing those mistakes proves I have lost my mind. Eleanor looked directly at the commissioners. The ability to change one's decision is not proof of confusion. Sometimes it is the clearest proof that a person still understands what she has done. The room remained quiet. Grace Holloway asked her final question. What exactly do you intend to create? A winter refuge, Eleanor said. Temporary shelter for endangered animals and isolated older residents during emergencies. Not a grand institution. A warm barn, a working telephone, proper records, and people authorized to check whether someone is alive without being treated as an intruder. After a private discussion, the commission placed the dogs in emergency protective custody pending a full cruelty investigation, temporarily suspending Calvin's claim to remove them. The board also approved a provisional permit for Red Lantern Refuge, contingent on repairs, veterinary oversight, safety inspections, and a governing committee that included Rebecca, Helen, Walter, Luke, and Eleanor herself. Outside the hearing room, Eleanor paused beside her walker. Luke stood near the doors, staring toward the street as though measuring the distance to somewhere else. Are you planning to disappear without saying goodbye? She asked. Luke looked at her.
I still don't know how to stay. Eleanor glanced down at the metal frame supporting her weight. I still don't know how to ask for help. We both have homework.
1 year later, the first snow returned to the foothills outside Red Lodge, with less fury than the storm that had brought Luke Carter to Eleanor Hart's gate. It settled quietly on the repaired fences, the roof of the old barn, and the new wooden sign beside the road. Red Lantern Refuge, temporary shelter, no explanation required tonight. The refuge was not the polished institution some people imagined after reading about the county hearing. One corner of the barn roof still leaked during hard rain. The furnace consumed money with the appetite of a spoiled relative. 2 donated cots squeaked so loudly that no one could turn over without informing the entire building. Eleanor complained about all of it. She complained about Walter's crooked shelves, Helen's habit of leaving veterinary gloves beside the sink, Rebecca's insistence on labeling medications, and Luke's belief that every useful object should be stored where a person could actually find it. Complaining had become Eleanor's least graceful form of gratitude. Those who knew her well understood that silence was more dangerous. At 80, Eleanor remained small, white-haired, sharp-eyed, and dependent on the aluminum walker she still called the silver nuisance. Her hip had not healed through the magic of friendship, nor had age politely stopped taking things from her. Some mornings Rebecca helped her fasten the buttons on her dress. On colder days, Eleanor's fingers stiffened so badly that she could not pour tea without spilling it. She hated those mornings, and occasionally she made everyone else hate them too. Yet she no longer hid every fall, every missed meal, or every frightening pain. Asking for help had not become easy. It had merely become possible. Luke did not live permanently at the ranch. He worked with the county's animal rescue unit, helping recover livestock, abandoned pets, and injured working dogs from remote properties. He still had the tall, broad-shouldered build of a man accustomed to physical hardship, though silver had begun appearing near his temples. His dark beard remained neatly trimmed, and the pale scar beneath his right ear was more visible when winter shortened the daylight. Luke usually stayed at Red Lantern Refuge for several weeks, then left for training, rescue work, or military obligations. The difference was that now he said when he was leaving. He wrote the date of his expected return on the kitchen calendar, even when Eleanor mocked his handwriting. For a man who had once turned every departure into a disappearance, that small promise required more courage than anyone praised him for. Lucy had recovered slowly. Her lungs remained sensitive, but her fierce curiosity outgrew her weakness. In spring, she was adopted by 9-year-old Emily Parker, a slight girl with honey blonde hair, pale skin, and a narrow scar beside her mouth from the automobile accident that had also left her afraid to speak. Emily's mother did not expect Lucy to cure her. Helen had warned them that animals were companions, not miracles with fur. Lucy simply slept beside the girl's bed, waited through the silent mornings, and never demanded words. When Emily eventually whispered the puppy's name during a visit, Eleanor looked away so no one would accuse her of becoming sentimental. The larger male puppy went to Robert and June Harris, a retired couple in Billings. Robert was a round-faced former mail carrier with thick glasses and a laugh that disturbed birds. June was 71, tall and silver-haired, and had survived 2 knee replacements with less complaining than Eleanor considered proper. They named the puppy Chester. He grew into a large, clumsy German shepherd who stole oven mitts and believed every visitor had come specifically to admire him. The mother dog stayed at the ranch. Eleanor called her Rose, not because Calvin Mercer had registered her as Black Rose, but because Eleanor said no living creature should have to carry an owner's name like a receipt. Rose regained weight, though the torn tip of her ear remained, and her coat never became perfectly smooth. She did not transform into a flawless companion. Sudden metallic clicks still made her flinch. If someone reached over her head too quickly, she sometimes growled. She did not follow Eleanor from room to room or sleep against her chair. Most evenings, Rose lay several feet away, close enough to see Eleanor but far enough to leave space between them. Their affection was built on distance respected rather than distance conquered.
People keep waiting for her to become grateful, Eleanor once told a visitor. She survived.
That is enough work for one dog.
Rebecca came every Sunday for dinner. She no longer entered with grocery bags as if arriving at a medical emergency, and Eleanor no longer examined every gift for evidence of control. They still argued. Rebecca thought the refuge needed stricter budgets. Eleanor believed budgets were invented by people who lacked imagination. Eleanor sometimes criticized her daughter's driving, clothes, or unfortunate tendency to overcook chicken. Rebecca occasionally reminded her that cruelty did not become wisdom merely because it came from an elderly woman. The difference was that neither used silence as punishment anymore. When an argument became too sharp, one of them would say, "We are stopping here." Then they would return to it later. It was slow, awkward work. Forgiveness was not a door opened once. It was a hinge requiring oil. During the summer, Walter traced Mary Bell's family through an old church record and a newspaper notice. Mary had died 15 years earlier. Her younger son was also gone, but her eldest son had left behind a daughter named Susan Bell Fletcher, now 62 and living in Helena. Susan was a retired librarian, slim and soft-spoken, with short auburn hair fading to gray and the careful manner of someone accustomed to handling fragile things. Eleanor did not telephone her. She wrote a letter by hand. It took 6 evenings. Eleanor described Thomas Bell's unpaid wages, recalculated with interest by a local accountant, and enclosed a certified check. She did not mention Red Lantern Refuge. She did not describe the dogs, the hearing, or her newly improved reputation. She refused to turn an apology into a story about how much she had changed. She wrote only what belonged to Susan. "Your grandmother asked my family for time, and I denied it. I cannot know what that decision cost her or your father. The money enclosed was always owed. I remember too late. But I do not want lateness to become another excuse for continuing to forget. You owe me no answer and no forgiveness." Susan did answer, though only once. She confirmed that Mary had found work in a laundry and raised both boys in 2 rented rooms. She did not say she forgave Eleanor. She wrote that her father had remembered the wooden horse he carried from the ranch until the day he died. Eleanor folded the letter and placed it inside Henry's ledger. Some debts could be paid in money. Others could only be named honestly and carried without demanding release. On the first snowy night of the new winter, Luke was repairing a loose hinge near the pantry, while Rebecca washed dishes and Eleanor sat beside the window. Rose lay in her usual place a few feet from the rocking chair. The red lantern hung dark on the porch because no emergency had been reported. A pair of headlights appeared on the road. An old sedan rolled to a stop outside the gate, coughed once, and died. A man climbed out carrying a small brown suitcase. He appeared to be in his 70s, tall but stooped, with a thin white beard, an oversized gray coat, and a knitted cap pulled low over his ears. Snow gathered on his shoulders while he stared at the refuge sign. He did not approach the house. Luke followed Eleanor's gaze. "Should I go get him?" "Get him?" Eleanor repeated. "He is not a sack of flour." "You know what I mean." Yes, she did. A year earlier, Eleanor would have said that a grown man could knock if he wanted shelter. She had believed need should arrive clearly, speak politely, and prove itself before crossing a threshold. She knew better now. Some people had been turned away so often that standing outside was the last courage they possessed. Eleanor pushed herself upright, carried the small oil can to the porch, and filled the red lantern. Her hands still trembled, but this time she struck the match without assistance. The wick caught, and crimson light spread across the snow. Luke put on his coat and walked to the gate. He did not take the man's suitcase or reach for his arm. "The kitchen is warm," Luke said. "You don't have to explain anything tonight." The stranger looked toward the house. He remained outside for a long while. No one called again. No one tried to persuade him. Eleanor returned to her chair. Rose lifted her head and watched the man through the window, neither barking nor retreating. Rebecca placed an extra bowl beside the stove without asking whether it would be needed. Eleanor did not know whether the stranger would enter. She did not know how many winters the refuge could survive, whether funding would fail, or whether the people gathered in her kitchen would still be there a year from now. For most of her life, uncertainty had felt like a threat that could be defeated only by closing the door first. That night she allowed the door to remain open. The red lantern promised no cure, no perfect family, and no ending without loss. It said only that someone inside was still awake, the kitchen was still warm, and there remained a place for a weary person who had not yet found the strength to come in. Perhaps a miracle in this story was not that every wound disappeared. Rose still carried fear. Luke still struggled to remain. Eleanor still needed help, and forgiveness did not arrive neatly. The miracle was that God placed them at the same gate before bitterness had the final word. People often mistake independence for strength. They hide their pain, reject kindness, and then use the silence around them as proof that nobody cares. But real strength is not refusing every hand. It is knowing when to reach for one, and learning to offer that same hand without controlling the person who needs it. Eleanor could not erase what she had done 40 years earlier, but she could stop repeating it. That is a lesson for everyday life. It is never too late to apologize, repay an old debt, visit someone lonely, or keep a light burning for a person who is afraid to knock. Please share this story with someone who may need that reminder. Tell us in the comments whose door you could open this week, and subscribe for more stories of mercy, courage, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, soften every hardened heart, and guide every lost soul toward a light that is still burning.